Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you just gave away pieces of your soul? Like every word you spoke was ammunition handed directly to your enemy? Have you ever watched someone destroy you in an argument, not because they were right, but because they knew exactly which buttons to push, while you desperately tried to explain yourself, justify yourself, defend yourself? Here's a truth that will cut through everything you think you know about power. The moment you open your mouth to defend yourself, you've already lost. Most people believe that communication is about speaking. They think power comes from having the last word, from clever comebacks, from winning debates. But what if I told you that the most devastating weapon in human interaction isn't what you say? It's what you refuse to say. What if silence, when wielded correctly, could make you absolutely untouchable? Friedrich Nietzsche understood something that 99% of people will never grasp. He saw that those who talk the most reveal the most. Those who explain themselves the most control themselves the least. And those who need to convince others of their worth have already admitted they have none. This isn't about becoming quiet or shy. This isn't about passive aggression or withdrawal. This is about becoming psychologically dangerous. This is about learning to use silence as a scalpel that cuts through other people's defenses without them even realizing they're bleeding. But I need to warn you, what you're about to learn will change how you see every interaction for the rest of your life. You'll start noticing how desperately people fill silence, how they reveal their deepest insecurities the moment you stop participating in their emotional games, how they project onto you everything they fear about themselves when you simply stop responding. If you're ready to step into a level of psychological sophistication that most people can't even comprehend, then keep reading. Because by the end of this, you'll understand why silence terrifies the weak and why it's the ultimate tool of the strong. From the moment you learned to speak, you were programmed with a fundamental lie. You were told that communication is about expressing yourself, that good people explain their actions, that you owe others your thoughts, your feelings, your justifications. This is the greatest psychological trap ever laid for the human mind. Every time you explain yourself, you hand over your power. Every time you defend your position, you admit that someone else's opinion matters more than your own certainty. Every time you try to convince someone of something, you place yourself in the position of a beggar asking for validation. Nietzsche saw this clearly. In his authentic writings, not the motivational quotes falsely attributed to him, he wrote, "Every profound spirit needs a mask. More than that, around every profound spirit, a mask is constantly growing, thanks to the constantly false, that is shallow interpretation of every word he utters, every step he takes, every sign of life he gives." Do you understand what he's telling you? The truly powerful don't reveal themselves. They don't explain themselves. They don't justify themselves to minds that are incapable of understanding them. But here's where it gets dangerous. Modern psychology research from MIT's latest studies proves that silence in negotiations improves outcomes by 15 to 20%, but only when you already hold power. When you're perceived as weak, silence doesn't make you strong. It makes you invisible. This is the brutal truth that no self-help guru will tell you. Silence is only powerful when you're already dangerous. Think about the last time someone tried to manipulate you emotionally. What did they do? They talked, they explained, they justified. They filled every moment of quiet with words, desperate to maintain control of the narrative. They needed your response to feel secure in their position. But what would have happened if you had simply said nothing? If you had looked at them with complete calm and given them nothing but your presence, they would have panicked. Because manipulators need your reaction to survive. They feed on your emotional responses. Without them, they have no power. This is why most people are terrified of silence. It forces them to confront the emptiness of their own thoughts. It makes them face the fact that they don't know what you're thinking, and that uncertainty is unbearable for the weak mind. Recent neuroscience research reveals something extraordinary about what happens in the brain during strategic silence. When you refuse to respond, you're not just withholding information, you're weaponizing uncertainty. Studies using EEG hyperscanning show that when one person remains silent during social interaction, the other person's brain goes into overdrive. Their prefrontal cortex lights up as they desperately try to read your intentions. Their amygdala activates as their brain interprets your silence as a potential threat. Their mirror neuron system fires chaotically as they try to understand what you're thinking. But here's the devastating part. While their brain is burning energy trying to figure you out, your brain remains calm. You're in control. You're observing, you're choosing. This is what Nietzsche meant when he talked about the will to power. It's not about dominating others through force. It's about achieving such complete self-mastery that you become unpredictable, unreadable, uncontrollable. The research gets even more interesting. When someone remains silent in a conversation, the other person's cortisol levels increase within minutes. Their stress response activates. They begin to project their own fears and insecurities onto your silence. They start to imagine what you might be thinking, and those imaginations are almost always worse than reality. This is the psychological phenomenon that makes silence so dangerous. You're not just refusing to engage, you're forcing them to engage with their own minds, and for most people, that's the most terrifying place they could possibly be. But there's a critical distinction here that separates the truly powerful from the merely manipulative. Weak people use silence as punishment. They withdraw to hurt others, to make them suffer. This is emotional abuse disguised as strength. Strong people use silence as protection. They refuse to cast their pearls before swine. They understand that not every mind deserves access to their thoughts. The difference is intention. Are you using silence to control others, or to control yourself? Here's something that will disturb you. Your culture has been systematically designed to make you weak through constant communication. You've been conditioned to believe that silence is rude, that not responding immediately is antisocial, that you owe everyone an explanation for your choices. This is not an accident. A society of people who can't keep their mouths shut is a society of people who can be easily controlled. When everyone is talking, everyone is revealing their weaknesses. When everyone is explaining themselves, everyone is seeking approval. When everyone is filling silence with noise, no one is thinking deeply. Cross-cultural research reveals something fascinating. In cultures where silence is valued, Japan, Finland, certain indigenous communities, negotiation outcomes are more equitable, relationships are more stable, and mental health indicators are significantly better. But in cultures that fear silence, particularly Western business cultures, people are systematically disadvantaged by their own need to communicate. American research shows that silence in professional settings is often interpreted as lack of competence or engagement. But this interpretation reveals the weakness of the interpreter, not the speaker. It shows a mind so fragile that it needs constant verbal validation to feel secure. Nietzsche predicted this. He saw that mass culture would create herd morality, a system where conformity is rewarded and individual strength is punished. Part of this system is the expectation that you will always explain yourself, always engage, always participate in the collective conversation. But what if you simply refused? What if you understood that your thoughts are too valuable to be shared with minds that can't appreciate them? What if you realized that your silence is more powerful than their noise? This is where most people fail. They think strategic silence means being cold or antisocial. They confuse psychological strength with emotional withdrawal. But true strategic silence isn't about rejecting the world. It's about being so secure in yourself that you don't need the world's validation. Not all silence is created equal. There are 3 distinct levels, and understanding the difference will determine whether you become powerful or just invisible. Level 1. Defensive silence. This is the silence of the wounded. You've been hurt, so you withdraw. You've been criticized, so you shut down. You've been rejected, so you stop trying. This silence comes from pain and leads to more pain. It's reactive, emotional, and ultimately weak. People can sense this type of silence immediately because it carries the energy of retreat. You're not choosing silence. Silence is choosing you. Recent workplace psychology research shows that defensive silence leads to knowledge hiding, reduced creativity, and eventual burnout. When you're silent because you're afraid, you're not protecting yourself, you're slowly disappearing. Level 2. Strategic silence. This is the silence of the chess player. You understand that information is power, so you hoard it. You realize that reactions are weakness, so you control them. You recognize that explanations are submissions, so you withhold them. This silence is calculated and effective. You use it to maintain advantage in negotiations, to avoid revealing your hand in conflicts, to make others uncertain about your intentions. MIT research proves this level of silence can improve outcomes significantly, but only when you already have some measure of power or status. But even this level has limitations. It's still reactive in the sense that you're responding to others by not responding. You're still playing their game, just with different rules. Level 3. Sovereign silence. This is the silence of the truly free. You're not silent because you're afraid or because you're calculating advantage. You're silent because you have transcended the need for external validation entirely. This is what Nietzsche was pointing toward with his concept of the Übermensch, the person who has gone beyond conventional morality and created their own values. At this level, your silence isn't a weapon or a shield. It's simply the natural state of someone who is complete within themselves. This silence is the most powerful because it's the most genuine. People can sense that you're not withholding anything. You simply have nothing to prove. You're not playing games. You've transcended the need for games entirely. But reaching this level requires something that most people are unwilling to do. You must be willing to be completely misunderstood. Let me be brutally honest about what happens when you start using silence strategically. People will hate you for it. They will call you cold. They will say you're arrogant. They will accuse you of thinking you're better than everyone else. And here's the uncomfortable truth. They will be right. When you stop explaining yourself, you are saying that their understanding doesn't matter to you. When you stop defending your choices, you are declaring that their approval is irrelevant. When you stop filling silence with comfortable chatter, you are refusing to participate in their emotional neediness. This terrifies people because it forces them to confront their own dependence on external validation. Your silence becomes a mirror that reflects their own insecurity, and they will hate what they see. Recent psychological research on defensive silence shows that people who use strategic silence are often perceived as less likable, less warm, and less trustworthy. But here's what the research doesn't tell you. The people making these judgments are revealing their own weakness. Someone who is secure in themselves isn't threatened by another person's silence. Someone who is confident in their own worth doesn't need constant verbal validation from others. Someone who is psychologically strong doesn't interpret silence as an attack. So when people react negatively to your silence, they're actually giving you valuable information about their character. They're showing you that they are emotionally dependent, psychologically fragile, and mentally weak. But you need to understand, this isolation is the price of psychological sovereignty. Nietzsche was clear about this. The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Wait, actually that quote isn't from Nietzsche at all. It's from Rudyard Kipling, but it's been misattributed to Nietzsche so often that most people believe it's his. This is the perfect example of how Nietzsche's ideas have been distorted by popular culture. The real Nietzsche wrote something far more unsettling. Silence is worse. All truths that are kept silent become poisonous. He understood that strategic silence has a dark side. When you withhold truth not for protection, but for manipulation, you corrupt both yourself and others. This is the ethical boundary that separates strength from evil. Here's something that will disturb you. Everything I've taught you so far can be used for evil. Silence can be a form of psychological abuse. The silent treatment is recognized by clinical psychologists as a manipulation tactic that creates anxiety, confusion, and emotional damage. When you use silence to punish someone, to make them suffer, to control their behavior, you're not demonstrating strength. You're revealing your own weakness. True strength doesn't need to hurt others to prove itself. Recent research on emotional abuse shows that strategic silence, when used with malicious intent, can be more damaging than verbal aggression. It creates uncertainty, self-doubt, and learned helplessness in the victim. It's a tool of psychological warfare, not psychological mastery. So how do you know if you're using silence as strength or as manipulation? The test is simple. Examine your intention. Are you silent because you have nothing to prove or because you want to make someone else feel insecure? Are you withholding words because they're not necessary or because you want to maintain power over someone? Are you protecting your energy or are you trying to drain someone else's? Nietzsche wrote extensively about the danger of what he called ressentiment, the psychology of the weak who seek to hurt the strong through indirect means. Using silence as a weapon against others is pure ressentiment. It's the behavior of someone who feels powerless and uses psychological manipulation to create an illusion of control. But here's the paradox. The people most likely to be hurt by manipulative silence are often those who most need to learn its lessons. Emotional manipulators, narcissists, and psychological parasites rely on your reactions to maintain their power over you. Strategic silence can be a necessary form of self-defense against these predators. The key is to use silence to protect yourself, not to attack others. The practical art: how to deploy silence without becoming a monster. Now let's get practical. How do you actually use silence in real-world situations without becoming the psychological manipulator you claim to despise? In conflicts, the power of non-engagement. When someone tries to draw you into an argument, your instinct is to defend yourself. This is exactly what they want. They need your emotional energy to fuel their aggression. Instead, try this. Listen to their entire complaint without responding. Let them exhaust themselves. Then, if you respond at all, address only the actionable elements while ignoring the emotional manipulation. Recent negotiation research shows that people who let others vent completely before responding achieve better outcomes than those who engage with every point. The key is that your silence must be attentive, not dismissive. You're not ignoring them, you're refusing to be baited into reactive behavior. In professional settings, the silence of competence. In meetings, resist the urge to fill silence with unnecessary words. When someone asks you a question, pause before answering. This pause serves multiple purposes. It shows you're thinking carefully. It makes your eventual response carry more weight, and it subtly communicates that you're not desperate to please. But be careful. In some corporate cultures, silence is interpreted as disengagement. You need to read the room and understand the cultural context. What works in one environment might backfire in another. In personal relationships, the silence of respect. This is the most delicate area. Strategic silence in personal relationships must never be used as punishment or control. Instead, use it as a way to create space for deeper connection. When your partner is emotional, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be present without trying to fix or explain anything. Research on therapeutic silence shows that holding space, being fully present without filling silence with words, can be profoundly healing for others. But this requires genuine compassion, not strategic calculation. The crucial distinction: silence versus withdrawal. Here's something most people miss. There's a massive difference between strategic silence and emotional withdrawal. Withdrawal is about protecting yourself from others. Strategic silence is about creating space for truth to emerge. When you withdraw, you take your energy away from the situation. When you use strategic silence, you remain fully present and engaged. You just refuse to fill the space with unnecessary words. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the overman or superman, is frequently misunderstood as someone who dominates others. But the authentic Nietzschean Übermensch is someone who has transcended the need to dominate anyone. This is the ultimate paradox of power. The moment you need to prove your strength, you reveal your weakness. The Übermensch doesn't use silence to control others because the Übermensch doesn't need to control others. They have achieved something far more valuable: complete self-determination. They are silent not because they're calculating advantage, but because they have moved beyond the games that require such calculations. This is why authentic power is so rare. Most people who seek power are actually seeking security. They want to control their environment because they feel powerless within themselves. But the person who has mastered themselves has no need to master others. When you reach this level, your silence becomes something entirely different. It's not a weapon or a shield. It's simply the natural expression of someone who is complete within themselves. Recent research on what psychologists call authentic leadership shows that the most effective leaders are those who have transcended the need for external validation. They make decisions based on their own values, rather than trying to please others or maintain their image. Their silence comes from certainty, not calculation. But here's the warning: this level of authenticity is threatening to almost everyone around you. People are comfortable with leaders who need their approval, because those leaders can be manipulated. A leader who is genuinely indifferent to others' opinions is terrifying because they cannot be controlled. Social media has created an entirely new context for understanding the power of silence. In a world where everyone is screaming for attention, the person who says nothing becomes mysteriously powerful. But digital silence operates by different rules than face-to-face silence. Online silence can be interpreted as disengagement or even hostility. The absence of likes, comments, or responses can be read as social rejection. Recent studies on social media psychology show that people who post less frequently but with higher quality content are perceived as more mysterious and attractive. But people who are completely silent online risk becoming invisible entirely. The key is understanding that digital silence must be intentional, not accidental. You need to be present enough to be noticed, but restrained enough to maintain mystery. The 3 rules of digital silence: quality over quantity. When you do speak online, make it count. 1 thoughtful post is worth more than 100 meaningless updates. Strategic unavailability. Don't respond to everything immediately. Let messages wait. Let comments go unanswered. Your time and attention are valuable resources. Treat them that way. Mysterious presence. Be active enough that people know you're there, but restrained enough that they wonder what you're thinking. But remember, digital silence is just a tool. If you're using it to manipulate others' attention or create artificial scarcity around yourself, you're still operating from a position of neediness. True power doesn't need to create artificial scarcity because it has genuine value. Here's the ultimate realization that will free you from all manipulation. The distinction between silence and speech is itself an illusion. The truly powerful person doesn't choose between silence and speech. They choose truth. Sometimes truth requires words. Sometimes it requires silence. Sometimes it requires action. The form is irrelevant. What matters is the authenticity behind it. Nietzsche wrote, "What we do in the wilderness may be full of madness, but it is our truth." The person who has found their truth doesn't need to manipulate others because they're not seeking anything from others. This is the final paradox. When you stop trying to outsmart others, you become unoutsmartable. When you stop playing psychological games, you become immune to psychological manipulation. When you stop seeking power over others, you discover the only power that actually matters: power over yourself. Recent research in what psychologists call psychological flexibility shows that the most resilient people are those who can adapt their communication style to serve their authentic values rather than their ego needs. They can be silent when silence serves truth, and they can speak when speaking serves truth. But most people never reach this level because they're still trying to win games instead of transcending them. They're still seeking validation instead of generating it internally. They're still reacting to the world instead of creating their own reality. The person who has mastered silence has actually mastered something far more important. They have mastered themselves. And once you master yourself, you realize that you never needed to outsmart anyone else. You were already free. You've reached the end, which means you're either genuinely ready for transformation or you're just consuming content like entertainment. Most people who read this will do nothing with it. They'll nod along, maybe share it, maybe think about it for a few days, and then return to their old patterns of desperate communication and emotional reaction. But you're not most people, are you? You understand that true power isn't about dominating others. It's about becoming undomitable yourself. You recognize that silence isn't about withholding words. It's about withholding your power from those who don't deserve it. You realize that the ultimate outsmarting happens when you stop playing games that make you stupid. The research proves it, the philosophy supports it, the practice works. But knowledge without application is just sophisticated ignorance. You can understand every word of this and still remain powerless if you don't have the courage to actually change. So here's your moment of truth. Here's where you decide whether you're truly ready to become psychologically dangerous, or whether you're just another person collecting ideas you'll never use. The choice is simple. Will you continue explaining yourself to people who will never understand you, or will you finally claim the silence that makes you free? The question that will reveal everything about who you really are. What is the one thing you keep explaining to others that you should have stopped talking about years ago?